We're good? All right. How's everybody doing today? This is like the second session from, how was the keynote? I liked it. I mean, David is a great storyteller. It's always a great opportunity to see David talk. So I'm glad that you got to check that out. And looking forward to talking a little bit about application insights. Just for curiosity, who here has used application insights? Okay, cool. Obviously I'll give you an intro to it and we'll show some use cases and all that great stuff. And maybe some things that you didn't know about. But before we get started, let's just talk a little bit about me. So my name is Levin. I've been a developer for 15 years, mostly in the Microsoft ecosystem, .NET area. I've been a .NET developer. I've done a bunch of different things. And I love .NET and I love talking about .NET. But it's not just about .NET. It's about like how we can do better as developers and what tools we can use to really have a great developer experience. And I think Application Insights is one of those tools. If you enjoy the way I talk after this and you want to follow me on different social medias, there's some here. I have a website. I also have a podcast called Coffee and Open Source where I talk with people all across the tech landscape about all sorts of things. I've had folks like Scott Hanselman, Kelsey Hightower, Liz Fong Jones. I've been doing it for 3 years now. I think I have like over 100 episodes. So if you like people like complaining about tech and all of the intricacies of it, like definitely give it a check. It's available on all the different podcast platforms, as well as the video versions on YouTube. So with that, I always like to start off the conversation when I talk about application insights with this. So anybody here, give me a little bit of does anybody here like have a definition of what the phrase observability or the term observability is, or telemetry? You can shout it out. We got a smaller group, so. Silence. Is this an Aussie thing? Just quiet the entire time? Yeah? All right, cool. I tend to just yap constantly, so maybe we'll balance each other out. So telemetry, the proper definition of it is like collecting information or diagnostics on a device. Yeah, it's used a lot in the medical field. And what's interesting about telemetry as it pertains to our apps, it really means all of the data, all the information that our application creates, not the information that our application consumes, like bank information or hotel information or whatever, right? Like the core to your business, like the actual data that your application produces. So let's talk about this. So who here writes web apps? Just raise your hand. All right. Mostly client apps, server apps, like Angular, .NET, Rust, Go, all the stuffs. Who here has their apps deployed to the cloud currently? All right, sweet. So who here has heard of or has used an APM? APM stands for like Application Performance Management Tool. Like some good ones that folks have probably heard of is Elastic, New Relic, App Dynamics, Datadog, Splunk. Yeah, for the most part. Hey, Splunk, everybody's like, yeah, Splunk. So if you're a .NET developer, which I imagine most of you folks probably are, who has kind of rolled their own telemetry mechanism? Like there's a lot of logging tools out there, like nlog, Serolog, Log4net, like all of the providers too, like have their own little flavor. Like who here has set that up in their apps, right? Okay. And then who here is users knows about App Insights? Everybody kind of, half of you folks kind of raise your hand. We'll talk about it a little bit as it pertains to like an intro, but let's talk quickly about, some questions to consider. These questions are rhetorical. Like I'm not expecting you to have an answer now or have an answer at the end of this talk, but just thinking about things that we can do as developers to make the lives a bit easier for ourselves. I like the second one the most out of these three. So like everybody here has had to probably ship a feature, right? And the business has asked us, okay, so like how often does this feature actually get hit? Like how often do our users actually using this thing that we invested time and money into, right? And usually you can, grok some information, like maybe you look at some request data, so you kind of aggregate it and you give it to them in an Excel spreadsheet and they're like, I'm like an executive. Can you like make this not Excel spreadsheet? And then you spend, 4 years making like a nice little like bar chart or a pie chart or whatever, right? What if you didn't have to do all of that and it wasn't as complicated, right? Your ability to basically quickly get the information to your users as it pertains to the usage of your apps without having to spend a ton of time doing it. So that's what App Insights attempts to solve. So what exactly is App Insights? So Application Insights, think about it like this. It is the APM, we talked about APMs a bit earlier, it's the APM tool that's built into Azure Monitor. So if you're building apps in Azure and you are taking advantage of Azure Monitor, like for VM logs or Kubernetes logs or what have you, all of Application Insights is an extension of that to basically light up this telemetry that we were talking about earlier as it pertains to your apps. And when I say apps, like, I know we're here at a kind of a .NET heavy conference, but it's not just .NET. .NET is obviously a first-class citizen because Microsoft, right? But there's also SDKs available for Java, Node.js, regular JavaScript if you're building like static applications or applications with, Angular or React View. But at the end of it, like App Insights is just like a REST API, right? So there are a handful of community projects for other programming languages, right? So not just the ones that I mentioned. And the use cases, it's not just like web apps. Like you can build App Insights. You can build like telemetry collecting mechanisms for App Insights for desktop apps, for console apps, for all sorts of different things. And there's some community projects around that as well. So really, it's not just, okay, well, I have to take advantage. I have to be a .NET shop or I have to be building a .NET app. There's all sorts of different options depending on what your use cases are. And when I say like telemetry, like I didn't actually define what telemetry was, right? So like this is the list. When you turn on App Insights, this is the information that you start getting by default, right? So it's not, you don't have to do anything more than just instrumenting your app. And we'll talk about what the term instrument means in a second. But like this is all very valuable information, like that you don't have to do additional work to get, right? Like, we've all been there where it's like, okay, so like, can you give me like exception data, right? Like that's gold, especially when you're in the middle of trying to debug or triage an issue. This is, I apologize kind of for the glaring, the dark background and white image, but this is kind of what the overall flow for App Insights is. So everything here on the left is basically the things that send data into App Insights. So like the apps that you build, whether they're front end or back end, dependency calls. So for instance, if your app is taking advantage of a SQL database, the SQL string, like that actually gets executed on the SQL database, can be sent to App Insights if needed. Other things like external services, like if you're calling APIs or if you're calling storage accounts or all those sort of things, those things are lit up for you as well. They all go into this big purple box of magic, right? Which in the long scheme of things, it does some machine learning, it does some AI to kind of sample the data, make sure that the data is coherent and there's like proper tracking and correlation through everything. And then everything on the right-hand side are the things that Application Insights exposes to you as a user to take advantage of it. So you can set up alerting, you can export to Power BI, you have a search experience set up Visual Studio. You can do continuous export, which is like keep my data like not in App Insights. Maybe I want to put it in a storage account or in a SQL database. Or if you want to kind of customize, maybe you want to build a UI on top of App Insights that's specific to your use cases, you can take advantage of the REST API feature that it has as well. Okay, so I'm interested. So how much? So the first thing to call out is that if you are building something small, it's free. If you are building something large, it's not free. That's kind of how the cloud works in a lot of cases. So there's a lot of numbers here, but the most important thing is that this is per Application Insights subscription. So like it uses log analytics workspaces, if you're familiar. Basically, that's like the all-encompassing thing that Azure Monitor uses to hold like logs, right? So when we take a look at just if you want to go today after this talk and play around with App Insights, it's going to be 50 cents per gigabyte. 50 cents per gigabyte after 2 gigabytes. I know it's very confusing. What the data is in App Insights is actually flattened JSON. So App Insights, it uses a JSON schemaless approach. So you can basically send any information into it. So for instance, if you have specific information that you want to track that's like not exceptions or not user stuff or not request information or those sort of things, you can send that data to it as well and store it also. Like for instance, one example that I always like to bring up is I was working for a client one time and I had to build kind of a YouTube for the enterprise inside of SharePoint, which cool, right? Like that's like the best idea ever. This is like before Stream. This is before all that stuff. And the customer wanted to be able to track, like, okay, what users watch what videos and like where do they watch those videos? Like, do they watch them on their phone? Do they watch the entire video? Was it full screen? Was it whatever, right? And I took advantage of App Insights to build that solution. And the long and short of it is that I was able to send like specific information about viewing a video to and store App Insights and collect that data and basically report on that data in a really meaningful way with Power BI dashboards and all of that. So you also get 2 years of interactive retention as well. So like your data stays in App Insights for as long as you want. But there are some caveats to this as well. But the most important thing, like I mentioned, is that it's free to like just play around with. You turn it on, you instrument your app, but then as you scale, as you want to add more and more applications to your subscription or what have you, there's going to be some surcharges, obviously. But again, flat in JSON, not like megabytes and megabytes of data just when you start playing around with it. It's like kilobytes or less. So the question becomes, okay, so how do I instrument? Like, how do I get access to all that information? How do I get access to all this stuff just available for me, really quickly? So there are a handful of different ways to instrument. And when I mean instrument, basically think of the word instrument as like turning on App Insights for your application. So who here uses like App Service in Azure today? All right. So if you use App Service in Azure today, it's super straightforward. So there's an extension inside of App Service that's basically turn it on. And what it looks like here. So this is the App Insights blade. If you haven't seen the Azure portal before, like this is the Azure portal, and this is like the App Insights section for a particular app related to that. So there's a purple banner. Click here to access App Insights. Also, if you create an app service today, like it'll basically create App Insights for you, like along unless you tell it not to. So there's a couple of different paths you can go down to do that. And then there's basically like a little wizard that shows up inside the Azure portal where it's like, okay, turn on the site extension. What sort of information do you want? Specify what kind of app you need. There's some things like profiling that you can add additional, or like do track MySQL statements. Like I mentioned, you can turn that on and off if you want. The next step is if you basically are an application developer and you want to get more extensibility into App Insights. So one of the things that's interesting about App Insights in that particular case before is that I don't need to make a coding change. My app's already deployed to the cloud. I just click a couple buttons and then all of a sudden I get all this information, which is pretty exciting. If I do like have access to the source code, I can make changes to the source code pretty straightforward. I can do this inside of Visual Studio. And the flow for that is you right click on that web project. You specify Application Insights Telemetry, or add an Application Insights Telemetry. This might be old. I think they actually moved Application Insights Telemetry up to like the top level here, but we'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then another wizard where it walks you through what that experience is. And then you get 3 green bars basically saying your SDK is added. You can also do this locally as well. So like for instance, you want to play around with App Insights and like what that experience looks like from like a usability perspective. You can just instrument your app locally. Don't need to make a commitment to Azure. Don't need to do any of these things. And you can see like what kind of telemetry your apps create locally and do Visual Studio search and things like that. So here's like the last example that I like to talk about. Like who uses IaaS? No one here uses IaaS? Man, Australia is awesome. Somewhat. All right. I make a caveat. IaaS on-prem, right? Like if you use App Service like in Windows, like it does use IaaS under the hood, like let's be real. But like if you're using like on-prem IaaS, deploying a .NET app to it, and maybe you don't have access to the source code. Like maybe this app was deployed like 10 years ago, and it's like, we don't touch this app ever. Like we don't even know where the source code is anymore. But you can actually turn on App Insights for that sort of app as well. So you can use what's called the Application Insights Monitor, which is the PowerShell module that sets up codeless instrumentation for .NET framework apps that are hosted on IaaS. There's a handful of different commands that turn on different features. But basically what it does is it injects some information into your web config as well as add some binaries into your binary folder. And App Insights does the rest. So even if you don't have access to the source code, and you still have the ability to set up App Insights if you'd like to, which is super exciting. And one thing that's really important to call out too about this is that I mentioned like you don't have to be in Azure in that particular use case. So like you could be on another cloud. You could be on-prem, but you can still take advantage of App Insights and all the great stuff that it lights up for you without like having this huge Azure commitment, which I think is pretty cool. So let's actually take a look at a real quick demo of like what it's like to set up App Insights in an application. So I'm going to go, pardon for my mouse here. So I have a application. This is in app service, obviously. I can actually click on it. And like this app is like really, really important to my business. Like my entire business runs on this application, right? This is just a simple like ASP.NET web form, like I think .NET Framework 4.8. It's been deployed to Azure. It's running an app service and all that great stuff. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to instrument this app a couple of different ways. So the first way is I'm just going to go into Visual Studio and do that. So, and if this is like hard to read or anything, please let me know and I'll change what it looks like. So here I'm in Solution Explorer here. As you can see, like I'm in Visual Studio 2022, and this is app services. You can see I have this app start folder. I don't even know what this stuff does anymore. Global ASAX, right? So this is a web forms app. I can right click here, and then I can go to Configure Application Insights. So I click on that, and then it's going to take me to that wizard that I mentioned. So I have the option to choose local or deploy to Azure. I'm just going to choose local in this case, and then click Next. And then it's going to ask me, it's going to tell me what it's going to do. So it's going to add some NuGet packages to my solution. We'll click Finish. And then it's going to instrument that app. And after this is done, we can actually take a look at like what actually happens, because this is a Git repository. Let's go right, close. So we open up Git changes really quick. And this is all the things that it did for our app. So it made a change to our app, our project. So this is basically, it added a NuGet package, web config. There's some information added here. So it added some HTTP modules, and it did some things like it configured some service dependencies. So if I was to run this app, just click Run real quick. Hopefully the internet is treating me well, because it probably needs to do like some NuGet restore. We can actually take a look and see what that experience is when we actually look at the different telemetry that comes through. All right. My mouse is all right. So all this is loading. Okay. So the application is loading here. Let's minimize this. Let's close our modules folder. Get this out of the way. And go to View. And then go to Other Windows, Application Insight Search. Get all this stuff, other stuff out of the way. All right, so you can select an App Insights portal, or you can do your debug session for telemetry. So you can look, let's just do like the last 30 minutes, and you can take a look at some of the telemetry that's come through already just from this app running. Close these. Goodness gracious. All right, close. All right, so you can see that there's some trace information coming in. So configuration file loading, stuff like that. Actually, if your application has more and more stuff going on, there'll be some more information here, but you actually have a Visual Studio experience inside, or an application insight search experience inside of Visual Studio. So this app is instrumented with application insights. So we just close this. So that's doing it locally. So pretty quick, right? So what if I wanted to actually do it in Azure? Like I said, I have access to the application. It's deployed to Azure already, and I don't want to make a coding change. I can go to this application insights pane, and then it'll say, okay, do you want application insights? Your app will be connected to an auto-created. So it creates a new resource for me in Azure. I can specify some information. So this is a .NET application. I can use the recommended or basic collection level. I can turn on profiling if I want to. And other things like Snapshot Debugger and SQL tracking. So I can click Apply. And then again, this is going to light up that experience for our application. So really, really quickly, in two different ways, like whether you have the source code or you don't have the source code, you can take advantage of App Insights, right? I know this is just a silly like web forms thing, but I wanted to prove that like it's not just like the newest flavors of .NET, right? You don't have to be like .NET 8 or using like crazy like cloud native stuff. You can have a .NET Framework app, .NET 4.8, 4.5, whatever, and take advantage of App Insights, whether it's deployed to Azure or not deployed to Azure. So that's super exciting. This does take a second because it creates a resource and then it updates the app configuration in Azure to actually be able to do that. All right, so with that, let's continue on. So that's setting up App Insights. It's funny because the mouse is like slides down because there's like a little bit of a lant. So like I look, I'm like, oh, my mouse is moving. So what do you do with this data, right? So there's some, okay, cool. So like we're talking about logs. I've looked at logs before. Like there's not a ton of really valuable information here. But what can I do with this data? So there are a handful of different things that you can do as it pertains to consuming the data. The first thing is when you create App Insights and you take a look at, and you actually go to the Azure portal, you get like all these graphs that just show up, right? So you can take a like CPU tracking, you can look at server exceptions, you can look at the responsiveness of your application. Like this is all available like without you having to configure, right? Like just a dashboard like this like can take a long time to get access to the data as well as just create it, right? So being able to just get that instantly is pretty awesome. You also have this topological view, which is called application map, which from a top down looks at all of the things that your application consumes, and as well as all the things your application is consisted of. And it basically creates like a mapping chart for you. So like, for instance, like this is my main app, and you can see it hits a SQL database and Azure storage and another third-party app called Contosal Retail Web and all these other things, right? So it builds like a correlation of like, these are all the things that my app does, right? It just isn't like a web app that's hosted somewhere. Like it also calls all these other third-party things. You also have the ability to take a look at profile information. So for instance, hey, why is my app running slow in this particular sense, right? You can actually drill down into the profiling information and see like, okay, so there's some hot zones that exist. Like I'm hitting an Azure storage table, and there's some delay here. Like, why is that? And you can take a look at some of the things here, and it'll actually show you like, oh, there's like CPU time that's blocked and things like that. So super pertinent information as it pertains to figuring out like, okay, why is my app acting the way it is? Or is my app in the situation where it can be running a bit better? And it gives you percentiles, right? So like this app is running faster in these particular cases and not, and so on and so forth. You also have the ability to create like these graphs really, really quickly. So like this is just like average CPU percentage by instance over time. So it gives you the ability to basically create line charts or create bar charts or what have you with like a WYSIWYG, like what you see, what you get experience. So you can just click these things and then it just magically shows up for you, which is amazing in the case where we talked about a bit earlier, where it's like, hey, I need to get some information to the business or to my team lead or what have you to give me some information about, you know, why this app is behaving the way it is, or is this feature being used at the rate at which we were expecting it to. And then another really important thing that comes with App Insights when you turn it on, when you instrument it, is this live metric stream. So one caveat that I didn't really mention at the onset is that like this isn't sending data to App Insights isn't 100% real time, because it goes through, if you remember that diagram, like that purple box that has some machine learning and AI in it, right? So there is a little bit of a delay between, hey, I send this data to App Insights, and then I actually can see it in the Azure portal. If you want to see real time, that's where live metric stream comes in. So it'll actually show you like over the wire your app actually running and doing all the things and showing you CPU and memory and network and things like that. So that's great when you're trying to triage things in real time. And then you wait 90 seconds or so and it'll show up in the, I guess in the topological view and all the other places. I mentioned Power BI, like being able to export like this data to Power BI is like literally a button click. So super exciting. Like this is something that I created probably like a year ago or so. It, again, super straightforward, like the ability to ship something like this to a business without having to like build it all from scratch is super awesome. I showed you really, really quickly like what the search, like this is a better view of it because I don't have like my machine like, you know, 1920 by 1080 and zoomed in 5000 to make sure everybody can see it. But this shows you like all the request details. You can actually filter by different telemetry types. You can take a look at all sorts of interesting stuff. And that's inside of Visual Studio, whether you're connected to Azure or not. I mentioned continuous export. Like here's an example, right? Like maybe we talked about 2 years of retention, right? What if you want to keep that data for longer than 2 years for whatever reason? Maybe you have SOX audits or things like that. The ability to just quickly say, okay, I want these data type, this telemetry type to export to storage, and then I can do whatever I want with it because it's just flattened JSON in a storage account somewhere. So it gives you the ability to own that data for as long as you see fit. Let's take a look at a couple examples of what you can do with the data once it's in Application Insights. So I have a little demo for you. I have an application. Who here like is an Angular developer or has built things in Angular? All right. Does anybody here for you folks, do you know what Tour of Heroes is? No? So if you like go through like the Angular like 101 experience, it'll basically build you an app that looks like this, right? It'll build you kind of an Angular app where you can have heroes and things like that. And what I did is I built Tour of Heroes using an Angular front end and a ASP.NET Core backend. And this application, it's very simple. All it shows is basically like the list of all of the heroes that I'm aware of. And since we're in Australia, I picked movies that have Australian like title characters. And I think one of the things that's really, really cool about this app, it's hooked up to App Insights and it was really, really quick, but I can, like I said, I can click individual, I can edit them, and I can do some searching. Like for instance, search for Mad Max here, but I'm getting an error message when I try to search. So let's try to figure out why that's the case. I can actually hop open to Application Map and take a look at what the topological view of our app is. So as you can see here, I have one app. I can take a look at some of the logs here. There's some failures that I see. I can look at slow request times. I can also do things like look at live metrics, where if I open this up, it's going to take a second to count down. And if I actually do make some calls, like for instance, I can hop back and let's just search for something else. I'm still getting an error message. But as you can see here, I'm getting exceptions that show up right here. So let's just open this up. And this is in real time, right? So it says I'm getting a system argument out of range exception. Maybe we'll take a look at what's going on later in this talk. But as you can see, like this is connected to my Azure App Service, and I can see all this information in real time. And then after, like I mentioned a little bit, it will show up in this view where I can take a look at that topological graph. I can also look at the failures more in depth. So for instance, in this particular case, it looks like I'm getting like some error messages here, some error messages here. So I can like click on that. Click on argument out of range. It'll give me a list of different samples of data that I can take a look at. Open that up and it'll give me like a view of all the things that it did. So look, in this particular case, it hit a SQL database, so I can click on that. Scroll down, I can actually look at the SQL query that gets run against my database. And like, I didn't do anything. All I did was instrument this app. I didn't configure like, oh, I want to actually insert like this SQL statement in there. It's actually tracking that for me. I didn't say like, hey, I want to collect exceptions. It does it for me already. But I can actually take a look at this exception right here. It says argument out of range exception. It gives me some information about it. And if I scroll down, I have this button that says just my code. Because, oops, switch the thing. I don't have to zoom it right on. But as you can see here, it gives me a line number, right? So it actually looks in my code. It decompiled it. And it says line 54. Sorry for folks in the back. I don't know why Zoom it's not working. But it gives me like the line number where this application actually threw an exception, right? Like who can get value out of that? Yeah? People that aren't raising your hand, like you're gods among men and women. Like at the end of the day, right, this is super exciting because you can just take an app, instrument it, and then whenever you have an exception, you can get a line where the exception actually took place, and we'll take a look at some other examples of that in the future. But you know, let's do some other things, right? If you remember when I was giving you those rhetorical questions earlier, where I was like, "Hey, I'm a business person. Can you please give me some information about our app and why it's not working the way I want it to, or give me some information about the usage of our app?" Well, I can just do that. So I can create what's called a custo query. So custo is kind of like, or custo or custo, depending on who you ask, it's pronounced differently, I guess. Is you can kind of like use a SQL-like language to actually hit your App Insights telemetry and get some information about it. So in this particular case, I want to get like all of my requests and I want them summarized by client or country of origin, right? So like the question from the business is like, who uses our app? Like what countries use our app, right? So I can write a simple query like that. So let's get this data over the last 7 days. So I can click that and then I have like this really nifty chart, which I can then, you know, I can share it with somebody. I can export it to Excel or Power BI and be on my merry way. And my boss is like, "That's awesome. This is the greatest thing ever, except like I'm hungry. So could you just make this like a donut chart for me?" And you're like, "Okay, well, maybe I'll, you know, insert this data into Excel and maybe I'll click like generate me a thing. Or I can just click this chart button and then it'll give me a line chart." It's like, "Okay, you mentioned you wanted donuts, right?" So I can choose chart type, scroll down, and then donut. So really, really quickly, Australia needs to pick up your, you need to like use my app more though. Let's just be real. So but like really quickly in the span of, 35 seconds, a minute, like I went from, hey, I have a request, can you tell me who's using our app, to a chart, which I can then export to Power BI or what have you, export a PNG or put it in a PDF or put it in a PowerPoint of all of the usage of my app around the world. So that's valuable, right? Like that's, I don't know how long most of you folks have been developers, but like I've been a developer so long that you had to actually go to someone to get something like this created. You had to be like, hey, like data design person, like who builds like SSRS or like crystal reports, like can you like build this for me? And they're like, that'll be like 3 weeks. And like, but it's just like a donut chart. Like, can't you just make it real quick? Well, no, because I need to get access to the data and then I need to like make sure the data is accurate. And then I get, no. You don't need to do these things. Like he just give me the donut chart. Here's the data. Nope, can't do that. So the ability to empower yourself to be able to do something like this is super valuable. And there are tons and tons of things that you can do on top of that. And, I think one of the things that I'm always in love with when I talk about application insights and showing like what you can do is when something like this comes up. Has anybody had this conversation before? Yeah? Like, okay, right. Everybody here is like, I don't know if this is going to work. Hey, like, stop what you're doing. Like, there's an issue in production. Like, the CIO is right here and he wants to figure out what's going on. Why does the CIO care? Like, the CIO hasn't been a developer in like 25 years, but whatever. He's going to stand over my shoulder and give me like hey, have you tried to like maybe do this? Like, that tool doesn't exist anymore. Like, okay, like this is in Fortran. Like, let's go on. So what are some of the reasons that we would have issues in production? Right? You can shout them out. Unless you're like, oh, we don't have issues in production. Anything. Help. Database failover. Oh, you're fancy. Database failover. What's a database? Anybody else? Config. Network connectivity. No one has said, oh, my code had a bug in it. Interesting. Yeah, no bugs, just features. Right? So there's a handful of things, right? So we talked about environment configuration, data exposing some bugs in code. Well, not bugs in my code, some obviously someone else's code. Issue with scaling. Like if you're building an app in the cloud today, like heaven forbid that your app isn't built in a way that like maybe 1,000 people use it at once. But anything else really, like anything can cause a bug. That's why we get paid, because these sort of things show up and it's our responsibility to figure it out. So how do we triage these things? How, like, if somebody says we have an issue in production, like, what's the first thing that you typically do? Logs, right? You can copy production data down to some local environment. Like, I mean, that's a terrible experience, but you have the ability to do that. You can use a production staging environment if your company is like fancy. Like, oh, I have access to an environment where I can just like test stuff in. Like, that doesn't exist in most cases. I can read the logs because I hate my life. Like, I'm going to read IIS logs. Like, that sounds like the best thing ever. There's one other thing, though. Anybody do this? Raise your hand if you've done this. You're a liar. Every single person in this room has been like, can't I just like connect to production like one time? Please, just one time. Like, I promise, like, it's not going to be a problem. Like, why is it a bad idea to like attach a debug, like some random developer's Visual Studio instance to like an application that's running somewhere? Why is that a terrible idea? It's going to halt the application, right? So like heaven forbid if you have more than one person using your app, that person's experience is going to be terrible. So like no, like I'm not going to do that. Everybody knows who Randy Jackson is, right? Okay. Sometimes I don't know. Like I did this talk in like Copenhagen at one point and someone came up and was like, who is the guy that you did like the thing for? I'm like, oh, okay, American Idol doesn't come to Copenhagen, I guess. But anyway, the question really becomes like, is there a better way to do these things? And I wouldn't be talking about it if I didn't have a solution for you, right? Has anybody here heard of Snapshot Debugger? This guy, I don't know why you're here. Snapshot Debugger, right? So I'm just going to like do the sales pitch and then like you can judge what you see fit. So it gives you full stack trace, local Windows experience, and a Visual Studio experience detached from your app from your point of exception time in Visual Studio for an application. Let me just rewind that back because I think I said it wrong. It gives you a Visual Studio experience of debugging your app through an exception in production without it actually taking down your app. Interesting. All right, Isaac, tell me more. This is the Azure portal. An exception happens. You can go to the snapshot experience and it'll give you call stack, locals, information about the exception. But then there's this thing right here, download snapshot, where you can download a file, open it in Visual Studio, and then get a point in time of the exception that your application threw. That's pretty cool, right? Let me show it to you really quick. So because the internet is a thing, I downloaded a version of this earlier. Let me just open up a new version of Visual Studio. So I threw an exception in my app a little bit earlier. And while Visual Studio was loading, let's just go in and take a look at what this experience looks like. So we can click on failures. And like I mentioned here, I have these argument out of range exceptions, but I also have this thing called two snapshots. So I open that up and it's gonna basically take a look and unwind all the information about that exception and show us what it looks like so we can analyze that snapshot here. All right, so as you can see here, like I have all this information. So let me just get this out of the way. So I have locals, I can look at, so remember how we were saying that my application was throwing like an argument out of range exception? So let's look at that code base really quick. So this is my heroes controller for my application. So the search experience is, scroll down. Where is it? It's this get hero, right? So it's inside of this get hero service. So let me open that up really quick. Nope, wrong thing. Domain hero service. Scroll down here. Right, so this is my code to do searching, right? Let me just zoom in a little bit. 125, not 400. All right, so this is my code, right? It's like lines like 50 through 53. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going against Entity Framework and I'm getting like, using contains to get like a search, basically see if any of those, any heroes exist that like contains the search value that I bring in. And then like I get like the third item into an array and then like I just return. So like when I get an argument out of range exception, why do you think I get an out of range exception? Yeah, because I'm trying to get like the fourth item in an array or a list when like who knows what the response is, right? Like obviously, like Isaac, that's not like a real exception. Nobody would ever do that. We would be quite surprised, right? So remember how we were saying like, oh, your application is throwing an exception on line 53. I showed that line earlier, right? That's it. I mean, it's not 100% that's it because it's 52 technically, but decompiled code is a thing. But what if I wanted to like get like a better point in time experience of that? So I can actually open up Visual Studio. Let's continue without code. Let's go to File, Open. Let's open a file. Let's go to Downloads. I downloaded one this morning, so let's open that up. And so the following file comes from an untrusted source, which I think is funny because the trusted source is Azure, but that's fine. Let's click yes. This is going to open that file. It's going to decompile it, and it's going to open up an experience. It's going to show us the DIAG session information. So it says, okay, we can take a loose dump file. It came in 11:17. That's the last write time. I can then debug with manage only. And then what this is going to do is it's going to load some symbols for us. Hopefully this doesn't take an eternity. Oh, maybe it's going to decompile our source code for us. And then it should, hypothetically, it should open up Visual Studio like with our source code in it, where, there you go. System and argument out of range. Index was out of range. I have data here, so I can actually, look at what happened. Let me just miscellaneous files. Let's debug with mixed instead. Debug with mixed. I don't know why it went into like the deep innards of like the .NET runtime. All right. This is probably going to take even longer. But what it should do is it should show like, oh, this is the line where it's shown an exception, line 52 of the heroes controller, or the heroes service, sorry. And then here is basically you have tooltip, you have all the experiences that I mentioned a bit earlier, like full debugging experience in Visual Studio. It's just not a point of time of our application. And I don't know what's going on here because it's probably trying to do everything. Let's just click this one more time. I don't know why this isn't working the way I wanted it to. Oh well. Yes, I understand that it's already done. All right. Debug with manage only. Help me, Obi-Wan. You're my only hope. I don't know why that's doing what it should be doing. That's weird. This literally worked like an hour ago. Cool. Anyway, so it does show you that you have an argument out of range exception, which is great, but it doesn't really. Let me see if I click on show call stack. Does it give me anything? Oh, that's because this needs to be a version of your app that works. There you go. I don't know why that didn't just figure that out. But as you can see here, so like I have this heroes experience, so I can hover over this. So I was trying to search like GLAD, which I mean, obviously I'm trying to search for Gladiator, but like I have a debugging experience inside of Visual Studio, and I can use the immediate window, and I can do all sorts of different things. Obviously for complex use cases, this is super valuable, right? Because you have like, oh, all the values of all the variables when this application, or when this exception was thrown. That's super valuable. I hope that shows you like, okay, like, and again, I didn't need to like do anything crazy to get this to happen, right? I turn on App Insights. I say I want telemetry collection. I want snapshot debugging built in. That's part of the wizard. And then it just does it for me. So super exciting stuff here. All right. So I have one more thing to show you. So you remember earlier how I said like we don't like attach to production, right? But like what if you could? So there's an experience with app service that you can use called Snapshot Debugger, because naming is hard, which allows you to actually attach Visual Studio to a running instance in app service, and you get a debugging experience without it actually taking down your app. What? All right, let me just show you what that looks like. So I'm going to close that version of Visual, like an older version of Visual Studio that I had open. So if I go to my app here, like this is just that same app that I had open. If I go to debug and I go attach Snapshot Debugger, I can specify the Azure resource as well as the storage account, click attach. And what this is going to do is it's going to actually create a connection between my version of Visual Studio and app service running out in Azure. But it doesn't take down app service, because what it actually does, it takes the W3WC process that's running, in this particular case, Windows, running in app service, it clones it, and then it connects Visual Studio by a proxy to that process. So the original app doesn't actually get affected, but all the traffic is ported over to that other process so you can actually track it. So it allows you to, hypothetically, theoretically, maybe not really, but quite, connect to production in Visual Studio without it actually affecting your productions application. So if I hadn't done this, if it does take a little bit of time the first time you haven't done it in a while, and I didn't do it this morning, unfortunately. But what it does is it enables the site extension for you. It makes that connection for you, and then it shows you basically the Snapshot Debugger experience. So it says like you can do these things called snap points. So you specify a snap point kind of anywhere. Like let's just do it in these controllers. So I can say like, okay, every time I create a new hero, I want to collect a snap point there. Maybe I want to, or that was pudding. Maybe I want to, for every time I create one. What this does is it loads all the modules as well for me. That's why this start collection hasn't opened up. But when it does, I'll have this little start collection thing. And I can also do this thing called log point. So if I specify here, right click on that snap point and click action, I can put it in a log message. So new hero. And then I can specify, if I move this out of the way, And this is hero.name. Right. So what this will actually do in the window, when it actually connects, is every time I try to post a new hero or create a new hero in my app, it'll actually write out to console here this line, which I think is really cool. And I can also send this to the application log as well. So as you can see, my modules have loaded. So I can close this. I can click Start Collection. And then it's going to deploy my Stamoids. And then when I go out to my app, this actually will take down your app for a second because it actually has to install that site extension. But as you can see, it's already running. So I can go to like heroes and let's just go, I'm my own hero. Let's just create that. So I can click Add Hero. And I go back and this should show up. There you go. So I have a snapshot here, right? And then I have a log point. So it says new hero is Isaac. So again, I'm not like, this is an Azure URL. AzureWebsites.net. So I have an application that's like running in Azure. I can see that log point. I can click the snapshot here. I'm not going to do that because that's going to download something from the internet, which may or may not take 25 minutes. But I had that. If I click on snapshot, I have that same Visual Studio experience where I can hit a break. It shows that breakpoint. It shows me all my local variables. It shows me all those things. So pretty cool. Alrighty. And as we wrap up, there's a couple of things that I think that you should take a look at if you're interested. So this short link will take you to a couple of things. It'll take you to some documentation about Snapshot Debugger and Application Insights. It'll take you to some videos I've done in the past about these sort of things. It'll take you to the source code, the GitHub repository for that application. And yeah. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope you see the value in Snapshot Debugger and Application Insights and all these sort of things, and how you can use it to like empower your experience as a developer to build interesting things and like not worry about when worst case happens, right? So that's it for me. My name's Isaac. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the rest of NDC Sydney. I'm looking forward to a ton of talks here. Always when I come to NDC, like the speaker list is absolutely absurd. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now, or you can find me out there and I'll be happy to have a chat with you. So thank you again. Yes, did you have any question?
Just with regards to Azure Functions application, can you do the snapshot debugging to Azure Functions?
Not today. There are ways that you might be able to in the future. You have a question? So that's a important call out. So Snapshot Debugger, the in Visual Studio experience, like where you actually do the attaching, not the opening the file that you download from the Azure portal, that is a Visual Studio like enterprise experience. So if you're not in Visual Studio Enterprise, like that's a pretty good way to sell your company. Like, hey, maybe can we get like this cool experience so like we don't take us 2 hours to figure out why an exception was happening. But yeah, thank you for reminding me to say that. So it is a Visual Studio Enterprise experience. This is the Visual Studio connecting to Azure experience, not the downloading the file and opening it in Visual Studio experience. I know that they have the same name, which is challenging. But yeah, so yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, you can instrument your application with like any ASP.NET app, yeah, core or framework. Any what? Any ERP system? Yes. So the question is can I use App Insights with any app that runs, whether it's on IaaS, on-prem, or on AWS, or GCP, or DigitalOcean? The answer is yes. So like you can use the two ways that I showed, there's like my code's not in Azure, right? Instrumenting the code locally or using the instrumentation tool with PowerShell. Both of those will get you that, and it doesn't matter where your app is. Obviously, just to call it out, your app, the data does go to Azure, right? So like if you're not in Azure at all today, like it might not be something for you to play around with right now. Maybe you take a look at the local experience and then maybe, hey, like we should use this tool, like we need to be on Azure, we should definitely do that. So, you had a question, sir?
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question. Like, how well does this compare, I guess, with like not.NET, like AWS and Node.js? Is the developer experience like as nice, or do you just have to do a lot more for the
So you asked a couple of questions there. So let's split them up. So you have an app that's like a .NET app in AWS, right? Node.js in AWS, right? So you would obviously have to instrument your app, your Node.js app, using the SDK or using the modules, right? But once that's done, your app can literally be hosted anywhere. So the third option, where it's like instrumenting the app where it doesn't have code and IIS and all of that, like that's really much for the experience where you have like a .NET Framework app that hasn't been touched, you don't have access to the source code anymore. If you have access to the source code, like a Node app, and then maybe it's hosted in Elastic Beanstalk or EC2 or whatever, right? It says, yeah, you would instrument the app using the Node module, like the NPM module, and it can be hosted anywhere after that. But just as a caveat, like I mentioned again, like the telemetry does go to the Azure portal. So there's some documentation. I think it's actually in the short link as well. It's like, if your app isn't in Azure, like you might have to open up some ports. So like in EC2, you might have to open some ports. On-prem, you have to open up some ports to basically send that data up to the App Insights endpoint. But yeah, Node.js, AWS, party on. Cool. Anybody else have any questions? Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And yeah, I'll see you around. Thank you so much.